Today I'm going to tell you about the Second Amendment and why we need to keep it. Patrick Henry, in a speech he said on June 5th, 1788, he said, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty, suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined." So, the reason the Founding Fathers created the Second Amendment majorly is because they saw when the British tried to take their firearms a removal of freedom. It took away their rights to hunt, to defend themselves, and most importantly, to protect their family. And so within this speech, I'm also going to explain why the use of the Second Amendment is still viable in today's culture here in America. And so to keep our rights, we must fight for them. And in that, what the Second Amendment truly says is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So now I'll tell you why the Founding Fathers created the Second Amendment. So what led to the Second Amendment, and I saw this on history.com, the text of the Second Amendment, which again reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." So during the Revolutionary War era, militia referred to a group of men who were banded together to protect their communities, towns, colonies, and eventually the states once they started growing. And it became very evident once the United States declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776. Many people in America at the time believed governments used soldiers to oppress the people and thought that the federal government should only be allowed to raise an army with full-time paid soldiers when facing foreign adversaries. For all other purposes, whether it be a riot or just town folk getting up in arms, they believed it should be used with part-time militias or just ordinary civilians using their own weapons. So their idea was that it protected the individual freedoms. In that sense, being able to protect their rights for freedom of speech, freedom of representation, so that a tyrannical government couldn't take over. And so the reason when I read that the second time, I put in that comma. Many people argue that, well, they're only talking about a militia. Militias haven't existed since about 1812. And so what a lot of people miss is that comma. That comma in there is a big break in the text to also say that the people of the United States have the right to bear those arms as well, not just your militias. So now that you know the history of the Second Amendment, I'll tell you why it's viable in today's society. So it's viable in today's society, not just for the protection of self-defense, but also for those tyrannical governments or an invasion. Part of the reason we're one of the strongest nations is because, as a quote by a man that nobody really knows, behind every blade of grass in America, there's an American standing with a gun. It's an exaggerated result, but that's basically how they describe American firearms. I mean, you could see movies like Red Dawn that showed the invasion and Americans fighting back with firearms. And so one of the biggest examples, and a lot of people right now, they say, well, tyrannical government won't raise up, you can't do anything about that. Well, from this article that I have from the New York Daily Post, I believe is what it was from, this actually happened in 2014, and I remember reading about it. There was a Nevada rancher that him and his fellow friends raised up arms against the federal government. He had his cattle on public land that were feeding. He had been doing it for 20, 30 years, and the government's hired cattle ranchers to come and round up his cattle and push them off the land. Well, basically, They then blocked off this land and started throwing anybody in jail who went on this land. This is the federal government here in Nevada. Well, towards the end of it, it got to a point that even guys with full auto light machine guns on pickup trucks were brought in by American citizens, and basically the federal government stood down. This happened just in 2014. This is 4 years ago. And so that's a big example. It's also viable in the sense of just the amount of mass shootings that have gone in. That brings in the whole concealed carry portion. You have these mass shootings that happen. Well, there would be a lot more that would happen, but a lot of them are shut down within a matter of seconds because of a armed, trained citizen that is carrying a firearm because that is their right. So now that you know that how it is viable today, this is my warning. So for younger generation, you need to keep the firearms. You're taught in school that they're bad and everything else. They're removing them out of history class and everything, and people are getting in trouble for them. But this nation was founded on firearms. It is the reason we fought for our freedom. Sure, part of it was for tax and everything else, but firearms were a humongous part in us winning the Revolutionary War. Secondly, the need for this Second Amendment also comes with that whole stance of you never know. If you get the wrong political party in power or the wrong person in power, you may be fighting for your rights, whether it be freedom of speech, freedom of religion, even if you look at the 1920s, freedom to drink. I mean, nobody thought that was going to happen, but then you had Al Capone and his gangs running things. And so when you get into that territory, that's where you have to start thinking about what the future without the Second Amendment might bring. You would have more mass shootings because you wouldn't have citizens being able to defend themselves. And actually, everybody says America's the #1 leaders in mass shootings. In countries like Sweden and Norway, where they've outlawed firearms to a point that it's very hard to get them. What the FBI describes as a mass shooting, which is more than 6 people killed at one point, there are more mass shootings in those countries than there are here in the U.S. collectively. There would be more crime. Big example would be Germany. Right now, Germany has one of the highest crime rates. There are more rapes, more robberies, more homicides than anywhere else in the world. I mean, you can even look at Chicago that has completely banned firearms, and they're rated as the most dangerous city on the face of the planet, next to Baghdad, which is a literal war zone. I mean, we bombed that place, and they have more homicides and crime than Baghdad does. And then tyrannical government. So just like I had told you, this happened, the Nevada rancher just happened in 2014. I mean, just a few days ago, Trump banned the bump stocks. That is a direct infringement on what the right says. Sure, you don't really need a bump stock. I mean, just saying, it's a piece of plastic. But then you have to start taking into consideration, well, can they ban scopes because that lets you shoot farther? Can they ban certain triggers because it is a lighter trigger? Does it ban certain grips? Then you start pulling in all these other options that they can come in and ban. So altogether, this is why we must keep the Second Amendment intact. All in all, the Second Amendment must not be infringed upon. That means any kind of ban, whether it be the machine gun ban, which truly nobody needs a machine gun, but that is technically a ban. It's an infringement. That people who were fighting in the Revolutionary War were using military-grade firearms. It travels. The whole Constitution was meant to be movable in a stance of whatever the future held. You think the founding fathers thought about airplanes having machine guns? There were machine guns back in the 1700s. They exist. You can look them up. But so they knew that there were firearms like that around. So we also must keep the Second Amendment and everything it stands for if we want to keep our freedom. If you have the wrong political power or the wrong religion get into power, you are going to run into the issue of your rights being stripped, which means You may not be able to go out on the street for whatever reason. You may not go to a certain shopping mall because of the color of your skin or what you believe in or anything like that. And so that's why for a younger generation, they need to keep the Second Amendment, because it is our only way of forcefully taking our rights and defending our rights. So thank you for listening to my speech on the Second Amendment.